The envelope was sitting on my kitchen counter when I got home from a 12-hour shift. Cream-colored, thick stock, the kind that costs more per sheet than most people spend on lunch. My mother's return address was printed in a font that was trying very hard to look like it had been engraved. I set down my work bag, poured myself a glass of water, and opened it. It was an invitation to my brother's wedding rehearsal dinner. Black and gold. Beautiful, honestly. And tucked behind it, folded once, was a note written in my mother's handwriting on her monogram stationery. Audrey, the dress code is cocktail attire. Please don't show up in scrubs or something you wore to the hospital. This dinner matters to your brother and to her family's reputation. We're asking you to make an effort this time. I read it twice. Then I folded it back along the crease, set it on the counter next to my water glass, and looked at my 6-year-old daughter, Willa, who was sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, very carefully feeding her stuffed rabbit a pretend cup of tea. I didn't call my best friend to vent. I just stood there for a moment and thought, okay. This time, I'm not skipping it. Have you ever been the person in your own family who feels like a footnote? Not quite erased, but not really in the story either? Drop a comment and let me know. And tell me where you're listening from. I genuinely love to know who's out there. My name is Audrey. I'm 31 years old. I'm a single mother. And for most of my adult life, my family has treated me like a cautionary tale they trot out at dinner parties. Here's the version they tell. I got pregnant at 24 during my residency. I was supposed to become a cardiologist like my father. Instead, I made a choice they've never forgiven me for. The man wasn't worth staying with. Willa was. So I left him, kept her, and finished my residency anyway, which, for the record, is one of the hardest things a human being can do. You don't sleep. You barely eat. You exist in a sustained state of clinical focus held together by bad coffee and the knowledge that you cannot fall apart in front of patients. I took a position at a hospital in a city that wasn't my hometown, and I built a life that looked nothing like what my parents had planned for me. But to my family, I was still the one who had messed up. I was still the cautionary tale. My brother Colt was the success story, 4 years younger than me, charming in the way that people who've never had to try very hard often are. About to marry a woman named Isabel, whose father owned 3 car dealerships and had a box at the stadium. My mother had been planning this wedding since before Colt had even proposed. I was invited, technically, but every invitation came with a subnote, a little addendum that reminded me of my place. The rehearsal dinner note was not the first. There had been the Christmas card 2 years ago. We're doing white for the photos. Just so you know, it photographs better if everyone matches, which I found out later meant my mother had specifically told me to wear white while telling everyone else to wear navy. So I would look like I hadn't read the instructions. There had been the birthday dinner where my mother, I've been calling her Susan in my head for 3 years now. It helps. Had introduced me to Colt's future in-laws as our daughter who went a different direction. Like I'd decided to major in art history. Like I wasn't, at that point, a licensed cardiologist with hospital privileges. She just never told them. It wasn't malicious, in the loud, obvious way. It was malicious in the quiet, deniable way. The way that makes you feel crazy for being upset. The way that looks like concern from the outside but lands like a closed door every single time. The rehearsal dinner was 3 weeks away. I looked at the note again. Please don't show up in scrubs. I hadn't worn scrubs outside of the hospital in 2 years. I put the note in the recycling bin, picked up my phone, and made a call. Dr. Audrey Walsh, said the voice on the other end, warm and immediately recognizable. I was just thinking about you. Dr. Hargrove, I said. I have a favor to ask. Dr. Elliot Hargrove was 63 years old, chief of cardiology at one of the top-ranked academic medical centers in the country, and the reason I still had a career after my 2nd year of residency, when I was running on 4 hours of sleep and had made a documentation error that could have cost a patient dearly. He'd caught it, he'd covered me, coached me, and then sat me down and told me that the measure of a physician wasn't whether they ever made a mistake, it was whether they learned from it and never made it again. I never had. We'd worked together for 6 years. He was the one who'd recruited me to my current position. He was the one who'd recommended me for the fellowship grant that funded my research. He was the one who, 8 months ago, had introduced me to Dr. Constance Merritt, director of the National Cardiovascular Research Institute, at a conference in Chicago. That introduction had turned into a collaboration that was now, quietly, one of the most significant clinical research partnerships in our field. My family had no idea any of this existed. They didn't know about the research. They didn't know about the grant. They didn't know about the paper that had been published in the New England Journal of Medicine under my name 3 months ago, which had since been cited 47 times and had prompted the NCRI to reach out about a possible advisory board appointment. They didn't know because they had never asked. "I have a request that might sound strange," I told Dr. Hargrove. "Try me." My brother's rehearsal dinner is at the Whitmore Club in 3 weeks. I have been strongly discouraged from attending by my family, and I intend to go anyway. I'd like to know if you and Margaret have any plans that evening. There was a pause. Then, the way he always did when he was about to say something he found genuinely amusing, he exhaled through his nose. "The Whitmore Club," he said. "Margaret's been trying to get me to go back there for years. They redid the main dining room." "I know. It's beautiful." "Send me the date." I closed my laptop an hour later. This wasn't a plan I'd made out of anger. Anger wasn't useful. Anger made you say things you couldn't unsay and do things you had to apologize for later. What I felt wasn't anger. It was something much quieter and much more final. I was tired of being managed. I was tired of showing up to my own family's events pre-apologizing for my existence. I was tired of the invitations with asterisks. I was tired of being the version of me that my mother had decided was true, regardless of any evidence to the contrary. I looked at Willa, who had abandoned her tea party and was now drawing at the kitchen table, her small tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration. "Hey, Bug," I said. "How do you feel about getting a new dress?" She looked up. Her eyes lit up. "Can it be purple?" "It can absolutely be purple." The weeks between the note and the dinner were, on the surface, unremarkable. I worked. I made lunches. I took Willa to her Tuesday swim class and her Thursday story hour at the library. I answered 46 emails related to the NCRI collaboration. I reviewed 3 clinical trial protocols. I did not respond to my mother's follow-up text, which read, "Audrey, I just want to make sure you have something appropriate to wear. Nordstrom is having a sale." I bought my dress at a boutique in the city. It was a deep forest green silk crepe, cut simply and expensively in the way that things are when the person who made them knew exactly what they were doing. I wore my hair the way I always do when I feel like myself. Loose, a little undone, because I've never been the kind of woman who feels powerful when she's uncomfortable. Willa's dress was, indeed, purple. The night of the rehearsal dinner, I did my own makeup standing at my bathroom mirror while Willa ate cereal on the closed toilet lid and told me about a dream she'd had where her stuffed rabbit could talk and had very strong opinions about carrots. "What did the rabbit say?" I asked, blending concealer under my eye. "He said carrots were for quitters." She considered this. "I don't know what a quitter is." "Someone who gives up." She nodded seriously. "Then carrots are for quitters," she confirmed. I smiled at my reflection. I had called my mother earlier in the week to tell her I would be attending. She had been silent for a moment and then said, in the tone she uses when she's working very hard to sound neutral, "Well, of course, it's your brother's event." Which meant she had expected me not to come. She had written the note assuming I would back down. I drove to the Whitmore Club in the car. My family didn't know I drove. I had a practical sedan I used for school pickups and grocery runs. The other car lived in a parking structure near the hospital because my life has, for years now, had 2 layers, the one my family imagined and the real one. Dr. Hargrove and Margaret were already there when I arrived. They were at a table near the window overlooking the courtyard fountain, and Margaret stood up and hugged me the way women who've known you through hard things do. "You look remarkable," she said. "So do you." Dr. Hargrove shook my hand, then pulled me into a hug anyway. "Table 4, he said quietly. I called ahead. "Constance will be here at 7:15. She's in town for a board meeting." I hadn't known that part. "You didn't have to do that." "I know. I wanted to." He held my eye for a moment. You've earned it, Audrey. Let people see that. The rehearsal dinner was in the private dining room, a set of connected rooms off the main corridor. Guests walking to the private wing passed directly through the main dining room. There was no other route. Our table was centered, visible, and positioned exactly where I needed it to be. I saw my mother first. She came through the corridor at 7:10, my father close behind her, both of them dressed to perform. My mother in a dress that was clearly new, her hair set, scanning the room the way she always did at events, cataloging who was there, who was watching, whether the impression she was making was the right one. My father, Gerald, in a navy suit, looking slightly overwhelmed the way he always did at social functions that required sustained conversation. Then she saw me. She stopped walking. Not dramatically. Just a half-step stutter, the kind your body does when it registers something it wasn't prepared for. Her eyes went from my face to my dress to the table, and I watched her register Dr. Hargrove. She knew who he was. My father had been a cardiologist too before he retired. In this world, in this city, Dr. Elliot Hargrove was not an unknown name. My father recognized him a second later. I could see the processing happening across his face. My mother recovered first. She walked over, and her voice was warm with that particular warmth that's actually a performance of warmth. Audrey, you look lovely. Her eyes flicked to Willa, who was sitting next to me very uprightly, clearly feeling very important. And Willa, what a beautiful dress. It's purple, Willa said. It is, my mother agreed. Then she looked at Dr. Hargrove with the careful expression of someone trying to identify a painting they recognize but can't quite place. Dr. Hargrove stood. He was the kind of man who stood when someone approached. He extended his hand. You must be Audrey's mother. I'm Elliot Hargrove. Your daughter has been one of the most exceptional physicians I've had the privilege of working alongside in 40 years of practice. My mother shook his hand. Thank you, she said a little faintly. You should know, he continued, in that unhurried way of his, that the paper she published this winter has become one of the most cited cardiovascular studies of the year. Constance Merritt is flying in this evening specifically to discuss her advisory board appointment. We've been trying to pin Audrey down for months. He smiled. She's very hard to pin down. Silence. My father sat down heavily in a nearby chair. My mother turned to look at me, and for a moment her expression did something I had never seen it do before. It didn't perform anything. It just went still. You published in the New England Journal, my father said. 3 months ago, I said. You can pull it up. Walsh, A. et al. It's open access. Colt appeared then, threading through the arriving guests, Isabel at his side. He was smiling the way he does at events, wide and easy, until he registered the tension at our table, and the seating arrangement, and the man standing next to me who their father had clearly recognized. What's going on? He said, more to my mother than to me. Audrey was just telling us about her research, my father said. Colt looked at me. Something shifted in his face. Something I hadn't seen before. Not quite guilt. Or like recalibration. His future father-in-law, Ray, was a few steps behind them. Ray was the kind of man who had made money young and spent the rest of his life trying to make sure everyone knew it. He came forward, and his eyes went to Dr. Hargrove, and he did a very visible double take. Elliot Hargrove, Ray said. I know your work. My cardiologist follows your protocols, textbook stuff. Very kind, Dr. Hargrove said, and gestured toward me. Audrey's the one advancing them. Ray looked at me. I had been at 3 previous family events where Ray was present. At each one, he had been polite in the distant, distracted way men are polite to women they've decided aren't particularly relevant. He had once, at Thanksgiving, said to my brother within my earshot that it was a shame about my situation. Meaning me, meaning my being a single mother, meaning the life I'd built. He looked at me now like he was seeing someone different standing in the same spot. You're Walsh, he said. From the trial paper? My cardiologist actually emailed it to me. I am. He turned to my father. Gerald, did you know about this? My father didn't answer immediately. He was still looking at me. In 31 years, I could count on one hand the number of times I'd seen my father look at me the way he was looking at me now, like he was trying to reconcile two images that didn't match. "I didn't extrude the talking," he said quietly. "I didn't explain myself. I didn't of the paperwork at the paperwork to the talking. Because you never asked what I was working on. Not once in 6 years." The table went quiet. My mother's hand went to her collarbone. It was the gesture she made when she was feeling something she didn't know how to categorize. Isabel, and I want to be fair to Isabel, who had always been civil to me, always polite, who was caught in a family dynamic she hadn't created, put her hand on Colt's arm and said quietly, "We should let them talk. We need to greet the other guests." Colt didn't move right away. He looked at me for a moment. "Audrey," he said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said, and I meant it. Colt had spent our whole lives absorbing the family narrative without questioning it. That wasn't malice, it was comfort. It was easier to believe the story he'd been handed than to examine whether it was true. I'd spent years being angry at him for it. I didn't more go be with Isabel. It's your night. He nodded slowly and followed her. It was Dr. Constance Merritt who walked in at 7:18. She was 60, precise, with the kind of presence that doesn't need to announce itself. She spotted our table from across the room and came straight over, and when she hugged me, she said, "I hear we're finally making the appointment official." "That's what I'm told," I said. My mother was still standing 2 feet away. Constance turned to her with the frank, warm directness of someone who has no time for subtext. "Your daughter is changing how we treat heart failure in women under 50. I want you to know that. She is genuinely one of the most significant voices in the field right now, and we are extraordinarily lucky to have her." My mother said thank you. Her voice was barely audible. My father said nothing. He was looking at his hands. After Constance sat down and the conversation turned to the work, the trial design, the next phase, the advisory board structure, I became aware that my family had moved toward the private dining room, the event proceeding as planned. I could see them through the glass partition, seated, the candles lit, the toast being prepared. It looked, from here, like a beautiful dinner. I didn't nix the contract to the caulking. About the work that had occupied the last 6 years of my life while my daughter sat beside me and carefully arranged the sugar cubes into a small pyramid. At some point, my mother came back. She didn't sit down. She stood at the edge of the table, and she waited until there was a break in the conversation. And then she said, "Audrey, can we talk for a moment?" I looked at her. She looked smaller than usual. Not literally, but the performance had gone out of her, and what was underneath was something I recognized but hadn't seen directed at me in a very long time. "I wrote you a terrible note," she said. I didn't disagree. "I have been." She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "I have been telling myself a story about you for years. I told it to your father. I told it to your brother. I told it to your brother. I told it to myself every time I needed a reason not to feel guilty about the things I said and didn't say. And I don't think I knew how wrong it was until tonight, which is..." Her voice caught, "Which is a very late time to find out." I waited. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight," she said. "I know that's not how it works." "No," I said. "It's not. I would like the chance to try." I looked at my daughter, who had finished the sugar cube pyramid and was now looking up at me with the uncomplicated directness of a 6-year-old. She had no idea what was happening. She just knew that the adults were being quiet in a way that felt important. "That's going to take more than one conversation," I said. "I know. And it starts with you telling people who I actually am, not managing the information, not the version that makes the family look better, the real version." My mother nodded. "I'll think about the rest," I said. She went back to the private room. I watched her go. Dr. Hargrove, who had the grace to pretend he hadn't heard any of it, refilled my water glass and said, "Ready to talk through the Q2 interim data?" "Yes," I said. "Let's do that." We stayed at that table for 2 more hours. Willa fell asleep against my arm somewhere around 9 o'clock. Her head on my shoulder, her purple dress slightly wrinkled, her small hand curled in her lap. I kept talking, kept working, kept being the person I had built myself into in the years since my family had decided I was a cautionary tale. On the drive home, the city lights sliding past the windows, Willa asleep in her car seat, I thought about the note. The one on the cream-colored paper. Please don't show up in scrubs. I hadn't. I had shown up as exactly who I was, and it turned out that was, as it had always been, more than enough. There's something nobody tells you about building a life your family doesn't believe in. They tell you it's hard. They tell you the loneliness. They don't tell you about the clarity, the way it feels, years later, when you're sitting in a room full of people who know exactly what you're worth, and none of them needed your family to tell them. You figured that out yourself. In the dark, on 4 hours of sleep, with your daughter asleep in the next room. You built it. And no one can take credit for that but you. I tucked Willa into bed that night and stood in the doorway of her room for a long moment, listening to her breathe. In 2 weeks, she was starting first grade. She had no idea that her mother had once been someone her grandparents were embarrassed by. She only knew that her mother came to every swim class, knew all the words to her favorite songs, and had let her wear purple to a fancy dinner. I didn't expect my family to see me. I just needed to stop letting them convince me there was nothing there to see. My phone was on the counter when I came back downstairs. There were texts from my mother, 2 from my father, 1 from Colt, which just said, "I'm sorry I didn't know." Can we talk? I didn't call him. I didn't explain myself. I poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard, and the quiet of it was different than it used to be. It wasn't the quiet of someone waiting to be recognized. It was the quiet of someone who had already arrived. I did me ready to respond when I was ready. Tonight, I just let it be still. I used to think the hardest part was doing the work alone. The overnight shifts, the boards, the research that nobody in my family knew existed because nobody had ever thought to ask. But I think the hardest part was actually quieter than that. It was sitting at holiday dinners for years, nodding when my mother implied I was struggling, staying silent when my father's colleagues asked how I was doing, and I said, fine, instead of telling them the truth. I made myself small to keep the peace. And the peace wasn't even real. It was just the absence of confrontation. What I understand now, on the other side of that rehearsal dinner, is that there's a cost to that kind of silence. Not just to you, to the people watching you pay it. Willa was 6 years old that night, and she had no idea what was happening at the table. But she was watching me. She watches everything I do. Kids always are. And the version of me I was performing for my family's comfort was not the version I wanted her to learn from. That's the thing about integrity. Not the word, the actual practice of it. It's not about grand gestures or public confrontations. It's about whether the person you are when someone's watching matches the person you are when someone's itchly, matches the were when no one is. I didn't spend 6 years building a life I was genuinely proud of, and then walking into family events and pretending it didn't exist because it made other people uncomfortable. That's not humility. That's a kind of self-erasure, and it compounds. Every time you let someone hand you a smaller version of yourself, and you just take it, it gets a little harder to remember what you actually are. Dr. Hargrove didn't stand up for me that night because I asked him to perform something. He stood up because he had watched me work. He had watched me make mistakes, correct them, push forward, do the unglamorous middle part of a career that nobody posts about, the years of getting it wrong enough times that you finally get it right. He knew what I was worth because I had shown him in real time over years. That's what intelligence actually looks like in practice, not the credential, not the publication. The daily decision to keep learning, keep refining, keep being honest about what you don't know yet. And the hardest thing I did that night wasn't sitting at that table. It was what I did afterward. My mother came to me and said she'd been telling herself a story about me that wasn't true. I didn't let her off the hook. I didn't collapse into relief and forgive everything on the spot just because she was crying, and I wanted the tension to end. I told her it would take more than one conversation. I told her it started with her telling people who I actually was. That took something different than endurance. It took a clarity about what I deserved, and the willingness to hold that line even when every instinct I had wanted to make her feel better. Willa asked me on the drive home if the dinner was fun. I told her yes. She said Dr. Hargrove's wife was nice because she gave her an extra sugar cube. She fell asleep before we hit the highway. I think about that a lot, the sugar cube. The way kids mark an evening, not by the power dynamics or the family reckoning, but by whether someone was kind to them and whether they got to wear purple. There's something right about that. The whole point of everything I'd built, every early morning and late night and choice that my family had decided was the wrong one. The whole point was her sleeping in the back seat, easy and safe, with no idea how hard her mother had worked to make that ordinary moment possible. That's the accounting that actually matters.